The Habsburgs, a family name that whispers through history like a chilling wind. For centuries, they held sway over vast empires stretching from sun-drenched Spain to the cold peaks of Austria. They were kings and emperors, warriors and diplomats. But behind the glittering crowns and grand palaces lay a relentless struggle. Life for a Habsburg wasn't all fancy dinners and bowing subjects. It was a constant fight for survival against enemies, against disease, against betrayals, and sometimes against their own crumbling world. You might think being born into royalty means an easy ride. Some of these rulers faced trials that would break the strongest among us. They saw their empires on the brink, their families torn apart, and their very existence threatened. Yet they kept going. This is not just a list of powerful people. This is a journey into the minds of those who refused to give up, even when everything pointed to disaster. Get ready to witness the incredible grit of the Habsburgs. Number 10. The last knight who built an empire, one wedding ring at a time. Imagine a ruler who loved tournaments, hunting, and poetry more than sitting on a dusty throne. This was Maximilian I, born in 1459, and he earned the nickname the Last Knight for good reason. He was a man of action, often found on the battlefield or in the saddle, but he was also a master of a far more subtle and powerful weapon, marriage. His life was a whirlwind of near disasters and cunning comebacks, setting the stage for the massive Habsburg Empire that would dominate Europe for centuries. From his earliest days, Maximilian faced an uphill battle. His father, Emperor Frederick III, was a cautious and sometimes stingy man. Maximilian grew up without a clear path to power, often feeling overshadowed. His first big break came in 1477 when he was 18. He married Mary, the Duchess of Burgundy. This wasn't just any marriage, it was a gamble for an immense inheritance. Burgundy was one of the richest lands in Europe, but it was also coveted by the powerful French king, Louis XI. Mary's father had just died, leaving her realm vulnerable and in chaos. Maximilian arrived a young prince with little support to claim his bride and her lands. The marriage itself was a love match, historical accounts suggest, but the political storms around it were brutal. Louis XI immediately invaded Burgundy, seizing large chunks of territory. Maximilian, with limited resources, had to fight for his wife's inheritance. He wasn't just a figurehead. He rode into battle himself. In 1479, at the Battle of Guingate, he personally led his troops fighting alongside them to secure a victory against the French. This wasn't a decisive win, but it showed his determination and ability to inspire loyalty. He managed to secure most of Mary's Burgundian lands, a huge win for the Habsburgs. Then disaster struck in 1482. Mary, his beloved wife and the key to his power, died in a riding accident. She was just 25 years old. This left Maximilian with two young children, Philip and Margaret, and a deeply unstable Burgundy. The local nobility, always eager to resist central authority, saw their chance. They kidnapped his children, forcing him to sign away some of his power and control over the children's upbringing. French King Louis XI, ever opportunistic, renewed his attacks, eager to carve up the leaderless duchy. Maximilian was now alone, a widower with a fragmented inheritance and rebellious subject. He was even imprisoned by the citizens of Bruges for a time in 1488, a humiliating experience for an aspiring emperor. He had to negotiate his release, making concessions that further weakened his position. Most rulers would have given up, but Maximilian refused to fold. He meticulously worked to regain control using a mix of military force and clever diplomacy. He tirelessly traveled across his scattered domains, rallying support, charming allies, and punishing rebels. Contemporary reports describe him as constantly on the move, seemingly everywhere at once. His personal struggles fueled an even grander vision. Maximilian knew that military victories alone were not enough to secure his family's future. He turned to what he knew best: strategic marriages. His motto became, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." He put this strategy into action with his children. His son, Philip the Handsome, was betrothed to Joanna, the daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. This was a masterstroke. The marriage, which took place in 1496, eventually brought the vast kingdoms of Spain, its Italian possessions, and its American colonies under Habsburg rule through their son Charles. Not content with just one spectacular match, Maximilian also arranged for his daughter, Margaret of Austria, to be a pawn in his diplomatic chess games. She was engaged and married multiple times for political gain. Though many of these arrangements fell apart, her resilience mirrored her father's. She later became a highly effective regent for her nephew Charles in the Netherlands, proving the family's knack for managing complex territories. Maximilian faced financial woes throughout his reign. The Habsburg lands were not as rich as France or Spain, and his military campaigns were expensive. He constantly struggled to raise money, often borrowing heavily or relying on promises. The imperial crown itself was not an easy prize. Though he was elected king of the Romans, the traditional precursor to being emperor, he never formally traveled to Rome to be crowned by the Pope. Instead, in 1508, he declared himself elected Roman emperor, a significant break from tradition, showing his independent spirit. Another immense challenge was the rise of the Ottoman Empire, threatening the eastern borders of Europe. While he focused much of his energy on his Western and dynastic ambitions, the Ottoman threat was a constant backdrop, forcing him to seek alliances and raise funds for defense. The seeds of future conflicts were always present, a relentless pressure on his fragile empire. One of his most enduring and perhaps most underestimated acts of resilience was his embrace of propaganda. He commissioned lavish autobiographical works like Poordank and Wijskönig, which portrayed him as a heroic, chivalrous figure, a perfect knight. These books, filled with detailed woodcuts, were not just stories. They were a deliberate effort to shape his image, to solidify his legacy, and to project an aura of power and legitimacy. At a time when his hold on power often felt tenuous, he understood the power of narrative long before it was a common concept. His final great marriage coup came in 1515 with the Vienna double wedding. His grandson Ferdinand was married to Anna, the daughter and heiress of the King of Bohemia and Hungary, and the king's sister Mary was married to Ferdinand's brother, Louis. This complex arrangement, though initially met with skepticism, proved to be an astonishing success. When the King of Bohemia and Hungary died without heirs, just a few years later, Bohemia and Hungary, two massive, strategically vital kingdoms, passed directly into Habsburg hands. This was a quiet diplomatic victory, achieved through years of patient negotiation and a bold vision. Maximilian I died in 1519. Having transformed the modest Habsburg house into a burgeoning global power, he had started with a scattered collection of lands and a challenging inheritance. Through tireless personal effort, strategic marriages, and an unwavering belief in his family's destiny, he laid the foundations for an empire that would soon stretch across continents. His life was a testament to the idea that perseverance, even in the face of relentless setbacks, could lead to extraordinary achievements. He never gave up, he never stopped fighting, and he never stopped scheming to build a dynasty that would leave an indelible mark on history. Number 9. The world's most stressed-out emperor and his endless wars. Imagine ruling an empire so vast that the sun literally never set on it. This was the reality. For Charles V, born in 1500, a man who inherited more power and more problems than almost any other ruler in history. From his childhood, Charles was destined for greatness, but also for constant conflict. He became King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, and Holy Roman Emperor. All before he turned 30. His reign was a non-stop test of endurance, pitting him against rebellious princes, rival kings, and the unstoppable advance of the Ottoman Empire. Charles's early life was complicated. He was born in Ghent, in what is now Belgium, and spoke French and Dutch. He was not raised in Spain, the core of his future empire, and initially struggled with Spanish. When he inherited the Spanish throne in 1516, the local nobles were deeply suspicious of this foreign-raised king. Just a few years later, in 1520, the Castilian cities erupted in a massive rebellion known as the Revolt of the Comuneros. This was a fierce challenge to his authority, a clear sign that his vast inheritance came with strings attached. Charles had to quickly learn how to govern, how to compromise, and how to assert his power. He successfully suppressed the revolt, demonstrating a ruthless determination that would define his rule. But the Comuneros revolt was just a warm-up act. Charles faced 4 major external enemies, all at the same time, for decades. First, there was Francis, the First of France, a fellow young, ambitious monarch who saw Charles's sprawling territories as a threat to French power. They fought multiple wars over control of Italy and the Burgundian lands. Charles captured Francis I in 1525 at the Battle of Pavia, a stunning victory. But even that did not end the rivalry. The wars with France were a drain on his resources and a constant distraction. Second, the Protestant Reformation exploded across his German lands. Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church divided Germany, creating a deep religious and political schism. As Holy Roman Emperor, Charles saw it as a sacred duty to defend Catholicism and maintain unity. He tried to reconcile, he tried to suppress, he tried to negotiate. But the movement only grew stronger. The Protestant princes formed alliances leading to open warfare. Charles found himself fighting his own subjects, a conflict that tore apart the very fabric of his empire. He scored a major victory against the Protestant Schmalkaldic League at the Battle of Mühlberg in 1547, capturing their leaders. But even this triumph could not extinguish the flames of religious dissent. The peace that followed, the Peace of Habsburg in 1555, allowed German princes to choose their religion, a painful concession for Charles, who had spent his life fighting for religious unity. Third, the Ottoman Empire, under the brilliant Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, was a terrifying and relentless threat. The Ottomans had conquered much of Hungary, stood at the gates of Vienna in 1529, and controlled the Mediterranean. Charles considered the Ottomans his most dangerous enemy. He personally led expeditions against them, including the costly and difficult conquest of Tunis in 1535. He spent years trying to unite Christian Europe against the Ottoman threat, often with little success. The sheer scale of the Ottoman Empire and its military might meant Charles could never truly defeat them. He could only contain them. A constant, wearying struggle on his eastern and southern frontiers. Fourth, there were constant revolts and challenges within his own Spanish kingdoms and their vast new American colonies. The native populations of the Americas rebelled against Spanish rule, and the logistics of managing an empire that spanned continents were staggering. The silver from the Americas funded his wars, but also created immense inflation, complicating his financial situation. His viceroys and governors often acted with a degree of independence, requiring constant vigilance and correction from Charles. Charles V was known for his stoicism and his deep sense of duty. He was often ill, suffering from gout and other ailments that made his constant travels and military campaigns a physical torment. He traveled more than any ruler of his time, endlessly crisscrossing Europe to deal with one crisis after another. He never had a fixed capital. His court was always on the move, a traveling circus of diplomats, soldiers, and administrators. This constant movement was a testament to his tireless efforts, but also to the fragmented nature of his empire. He faced immense personal tragedy as well. His beloved wife, Isabella of Portugal, died in 1539, a blow from which he never fully recovered. He never remarried, a rarity for a monarch, and her death deepened his already melancholic nature. He was deeply religious, but the ongoing religious divisions of Europe tormented him. He felt personally responsible for the schism, believing he had failed to prevent it. By the mid-1550s, after decades of relentless struggle, Charles V was utterly exhausted. His body was failing and his spirit was worn down. He made the unprecedented decision to abdicate his vast empire, dividing it between his son, Philip II, and his brother Ferdinand I. In a series of emotional ceremonies in 1555 and 1556, he formally gave up his various crowns. He then retired to a small monastery in Eustace, Spain, where he lived out his remaining 2 years. Free from the crushing weight of his imperial duties, Charles V's reign was a marathon of resilience. He inherited a collection of disparate lands, faced an unparalleled array of challenges, and somehow managed to keep his empire largely intact, despite being constantly besieged from all sides. He was not a flashy king, but a diligent, deeply burdened, and utterly relentless emperor who never gave up until he literally could not continue. His sheer endurance shaped the future of Europe and the world. Number 8. The Emperor who saved Christianity by the skin of his teeth. Step into a time when religious wars tore Europe apart, and an empire seemed on the verge of collapse. This was the world of Ferdinand II, born in 1578. A devout Catholic Habsburg, who inherited a kingdom simmering with Protestant rebellion. His reign began in the crucible of the Bohemian Revolt, which sparked the devastating 30 Years' War. A conflict that would nearly destroy him and reshape the continent. Ferdinand's survival and ultimate triumph against incredible odds is a story of iron will and unwavering conviction. Ferdinand's upbringing was strict and Jesuit. He was educated to be a staunch defender of the Catholic faith, and he took this role very seriously. He believed it was his sacred duty to restore Catholicism to his lands, which had seen a significant rise in Protestantism. This rigid adherence to his faith would be both his greatest strength and the source of his gravest challenges. His first major test came quickly. In 1618, just after he was elected King of Bohemia, his Catholic officials were literally thrown out of a window in Prague by angry Protestant nobles. This infamous defenestration of Prague was not just a prank. It was an open act of rebellion, a direct challenge to Habsburg authority, and it ignited the Bohemian Revolt. The Bohemian estates deposed Ferdinand and elected Frederick V, a Calvinist prince, as their new king. This was a humiliating blow, threatening to unravel the Habsburg domains and potentially costing him the imperial crown itself. Ferdinand was in a desperate situation. He had few resources, little money, and no standing army to speak of. His own imperial title was not yet secure, and many German princes were hesitant to support him. His family even put pressure on him to compromise, to back down and allow religious tolerance. But Ferdinand refused. He believed God was on his side, and he would not abandon his mission. He stubbornly held his ground, borrowing money from his relatives, leveraging old alliances, and meticulously building a coalition. His fortunes began to turn at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. With the help of the Catholic League and Spanish forces, Ferdinand's army crushed the Bohemian rebels. This was a decisive victory, allowing him to impose his will on Bohemia, suppress Protestantism, and consolidate Habsburg power. He executed rebel leaders, confiscated their lands, and began a forced recatholization of the region. This victory, however, only widened the conflict, drawing more and more European powers into what became the 30 Years' War. The war escalated, becoming a brutal continent-wide struggle. Ferdinand faced new and formidable enemies. Christian IV of Denmark intervened, supporting the Protestant cause. Then came the Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, a brilliant military commander, who swept through Germany, winning stunning victories against imperial forces. At one point, the Swedes were so successful that Vienna itself was threatened. Imperial armies suffered devastating defeats, and the financial strain on Ferdinand's empire was immense. His generals often squabbled, and his war efforts were plagued by corruption and inefficiency. Through it all, Ferdinand remained unyielding. He held countless prayer vigils, believing that divine intervention would ultimately secure his victory. He was a man of deep personal piety, who spent hours in prayer daily. This unwavering faith, bordering on fanaticism, gave him an incredible inner strength. He replaced generals who failed him tirelessly, raised new armies, and never wavered in his conviction that the Catholic cause would prevail. He made difficult political decisions, sometimes alienating allies, but always prioritizing what he saw as the greater good of his faith and dynasty. His most controversial move was the Edict of Restitution in 1629. This decree aimed to restore all church lands that had been secularized since 1552, a move that would greatly benefit the Catholic Church, but stripped many Protestant princes of their wealth and power. This aggressive act generated widespread opposition and prolonged the war, showing his absolute commitment to his religious ideals, even at immense political cost. Despite the near-constant warfare, the financial ruin of his lands, and the immense suffering of his people, he saw himself as an instrument of God's will. He lived to see the tide turn, albeit slowly and painfully. His general Albrecht von Wallenstein, though controversial, managed to win important victories. After Wallenstein's assassination, Ferdinand continued to press the war, eventually securing some stability. The Peace of Prague in 1635, a separate peace with many German Protestant princes, marked a turning point, though the larger war continued beyond his lifetime. Ferdinand II died in 1637, still in the midst of the 30 Years' War. He left his successor an empire ravaged by conflict. But crucially, he had preserved the Habsburg dynastic lands and the Catholic faith. Within them, he began his reign on the brink of losing everything, with his authority openly challenged and his capital under threat. His resilience stemmed from an almost fanatical religious conviction, an unshakable belief that he was destined to restore his faith and his family's power. He endured betrayals, defeats, and unimaginable destruction, emerging from the fire with his core beliefs intact, a true testament to his relentless will. Number 7. The Unflappable Emperor, who beat back the Turks. Imagine leading an empire where the enemy was not just a rival kingdom, but a powerful invading force that had conquered vast swaths of land and threatened the very heart of Europe. This was the life of Leopold I. He was a quiet, studious man, never expected to be emperor. But fate had other plans. His older brother died unexpectedly, thrusting Leopold onto the throne. For 47 years, one of the longest reigns in Habsburg history, Leopold faced a constant barrage of challenges, most notably the relentless Ottoman Empire and the expansionist ambitions of France's son King Louis XIV. His ability to stay calm and persistent in the face of overwhelming pressure truly defines resilience. Leopold was originally destined for a career in the church. He received an excellent education, learning multiple languages and developing a love for science and art. This background gave him a thoughtful, cautious nature, but also a deep understanding of diplomacy and strategy. When his brother Ferdinand IV died in 1654, Leopold became the heir, and in 1658 he was elected Holy Roman Emperor. He was only 18, and the weight of the sprawling, often chaotic Holy Roman Empire immediately fell on his young shoulders. His reign was marked by two persistent and existential threats. The first and most terrifying was the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Ottomans had been expanding westward, conquering Hungary, and repeatedly pushing into Habsburg territory. In 1683, the situation reached its peak. A massive Ottoman army, estimated at 150,000 to 200,000 soldiers, marched on Vienna, the Habsburg capital. This was not just a border skirmish. It was a siege that threatened to extinguish the Habsburg dynasty and potentially open Central Europe to Ottoman control. Leopold, his family, and much of his court fled Vienna as the siege began. A necessary but humiliating act. The city was left to a small garrison and its citizens. The situation was desperate. Weeks passed. Vienna was under immense pressure, and its defenders were running out of supplies and hope. The city was on the verge of falling. Many in Europe believed it was only a matter of time, but Leopold, from his temporary refuge, tirelessly worked to rally support. He sent desperate pleas to other European rulers, reminding them of the common Christian threat. He coordinated with Polish King John, the Third Sobieski, who famously led a relief army that included Polish hussars and elite cavalry force. On September 12, 1683, this combined relief force launched a surprise attack on the Ottoman besiegers. The Battle of Vienna was a decisive Christian victory, forcing the Ottomans to retreat. This was a turning point, not just for Leopold, but for Europe, marking the beginning of the end of Ottoman expansion into the continent. The victory at Vienna did not end the Ottoman threat immediately, but it marked a shift. Leopold then launched a series of successful campaigns known as the Great Turkish War, lasting from 1683 to 1699. Under his command, and with the help of brilliant generals like Prince Eugene of Savoy, the Habsburg armies gradually pushed the Ottomans back. They recaptured significant parts of Hungary, including Budapest, and extended Habsburg control deep into the Balkans. This required immense military and financial effort, and Leopold showed an incredible ability to sustain a prolonged war, even while facing other major challenges. His second great adversary was Louis XIV. Of France, Louis, the Sun King, was at the height of his power and saw the Habsburgs as his main rival for European dominance. He waged multiple wars against Leopold, including the 9 Years' War, and, most significantly, the War of the Spanish Succession. Louis often attacked, while Leopold was preoccupied with the Ottomans, forcing the emperor to fight on multiple fronts. These wars were costly and destructive, constantly testing Leopold's resolve and draining his treasury. Leopold was known for his calm demeanor and his methodical approach. He was not a military leader like some of his predecessors, but he was an incredibly effective administrator and diplomat. He relied on a strong network of advisors and was skilled at building alliances. He understood that patience and persistence were key. He outlasted his enemies, often benefiting from their overreach or internal problems. His personal life was also marked by resilience. He married 3 times, losing his first 2 wives and many of his children to disease. The infant mortality rate was shockingly high, even for royalty, and Leopold endured repeated personal tragedies. Each loss was a profound blow, yet he continued his duties, focused on the survival of his dynasty and his empire. By the end of his reign in 1705, Leopold had not only survived the Ottoman onslaught, but had turned the tide, securing vast new territories for the Habsburgs in Hungary. He had also held his own against the might of France, preventing Louis XIV from dominating Europe. He left his successor a larger, more secure, and more centralized empire. Leopold I was an emperor who faced down 2 superpowers simultaneously, held his ground, and ultimately expanded his domain. His quiet strength and unyielding determination, in the face of decades of relentless pressure, made him one of the most resilient Habsburgs. Number 6. The unlucky emperor who made sure his daughter could rule. Imagine being born with an immense weight on your shoulders, not just the crown, but the desperate need to secure your family's future against all historical precedent. This was the challenge for Charles VI, born in 1685. He became Holy Roman Emperor, King of Bohemia, Hungary, and Archduke of Austria. But his greatest struggle wasn't against an invading army or a political rival. It was against nature itself. He struggled to produce a male heir. This personal struggle shaped his entire reign, as he dedicated his life to securing the right of his daughter, Maria Theresa, to inherit his vast and diverse lands. Charles VI was the younger son of Emperor Leopold I. He was well-educated and intelligent, groomed for leadership. His early life was dominated by the War of the Spanish Succession, where he was put forward as the Habsburg claimant to the Spanish throne. He spent years fighting in Spain, even being crowned King of Spain in Madrid, before a series of deaths in the Habsburg family changed everything. His older brother, Emperor Joseph I, died unexpectedly in 1711, leaving Charles as the sole surviving male. Habsburg. This meant he had to return to Vienna to become Holy Roman Emperor, essentially giving up his claim to Spain. It was a cruel twist of fate, forcing him to abandon a dream. Once emperor, The problem of the succession quickly became his obsession. Charles had no sons. He had daughters, but Habsburg tradition and the Salic law prevalent in many German states generally excluded women from inheriting major titles. This meant that upon his death, his vast and diverse collection of kingdoms, duchies, and territories could be broken apart, divided among male relatives, or even claimed by foreign powers. The very survival of the Habsburg monarchy. So, Charles VI embarked on a lifelong, tireless, and utterly single-minded campaign to ensure his eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, could inherit everything. Intact, he created a legal document known as the Pragmatic Sanction. Issued in 1713, this decree stated that all Habsburg lands would be indivisible and could be inherited by a female heir. If there were no male ones, it was a revolutionary concept for the time. Getting this document recognized was an incredibly difficult task. Charles spent the next 2 decades of his reign engaged in constant diplomacy, making concessions, fighting wars, and signing treaties, all with the primary goal of securing international recognition for the Pragmatic Sanction. He sacrificed imperial territories, entered into unfavorable alliances, and poured vast sums of money into bribing foreign courts. For example, he traded parts of his Italian territories, such as Naples and Sicily, to other powers in exchange for their signatures on the sanction. He even went to war, such as the War of the Polish Succession, partly to gain diplomatic leverage for his cause. Despite his efforts, the recognition was often conditional and fragile. Many European powers signed the Pragmatic Sanction with their fingers crossed behind their backs, fully intending to challenge it upon Charles's death. They saw the Habsburg succession crisis as an opportunity to carve up the empire or weaken its power. Charles knew this, but he pressed on, believing that a formal agreement, however precarious, was better than no agreement at all. His personal life was marked by the constant anxiety of succession. He desperately wanted his son, undergoing various treatments and pilgrimages. His wife, Elizabeth Christine, gave birth to several children, but only 3 daughters survived to adulthood. The death of his only son, Leopold, in infancy was a devastating blow, solidifying Maria Theresa as his sole heir and intensifying his efforts to secure her future. This personal anguish fueled his political determination. The empire was constantly strained by wars and the immense cost of his diplomatic efforts. He often had to resort to desperate measures to raise funds, further burdening his subjects. His armies were often underfunded and ill-prepared, a consequence of his focus on diplomatic rather than military solutions. He was a diplomat, not a warrior, and his reign was defined by treaties more than battles. When Charles VI died in 1740, the Pragmatic Sanction was theoretically recognized by most European powers. But his death immediately triggered a massive war, the War of the Austrian Succession, as many of those same powers broke their promises and tried to seize Habsburg lands. It was a bitter validation of Charles's fears. Yet his tireless work had laid the legal groundwork for Maria Theresa's claim. Without the Pragmatic Sanction, her position would have been far weaker, perhaps impossible. Charles VI was not a mighty or militarily brilliant ruler. He was a cautious, perhaps even anxious, monarch whose single-minded pursuit of a seemingly impossible goal defined his reign. He dedicated his life to a dynastic problem, enduring constant diplomatic maneuvering, financial strain, and personal disappointment. His resilience lay in his unwavering focus on his daughter's right to inherit, a quiet but profound determination that, against all odds, gave Maria Theresa the legal standing she needed to fight for her empire. He fought for his daughter's future even when he could not guarantee her success. Number 5. The Empress who defied an empire and won her throne. Imagine being a young woman just 23 years old suddenly thrust onto the throne of a vast crumbling empire, only to be immediately attacked by almost every major power in Europe. This was the impossible situation of Maria Theresa. Born in 1717, she was not supposed to rule. Her father, Charles VI, spent his life trying to ensure she could, but when he died in 1740, the promises of other European rulers dissolved into a brutal war. Maria Theresa, a mother of 4, and pregnant with her 5th child, fought for her inheritance with a ferocity and resilience that stunned the world and reshaped European history. Maria Theresa's early life was relatively sheltered. She received an excellent education, but she was trained more as a future queen consort than as a reigning monarch. She had a happy marriage to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, whom she deeply loved. Her father's relentless efforts to secure the pragmatic sanction meant she knew she might inherit. But the reality of his death plunged her into an immediate and terrifying crisis. The ink was barely dry on Charles VI's death certificate when Frederick II of Prussia, a cunning and ambitious young king, invaded Silesia, one of the richest Habsburg provinces. This unprovoked attack was the spark that ignited the War of the Austrian Succession. France, Bavaria, Spain, and others quickly joined in, all eager to carve up the Habsburg lands. Bavaria even claimed the Holy Roman Empire itself. Maria Theresa's treasury was empty. Her army was poorly equipped and led, and her position seemed hopeless. The young Archduchess, pregnant and facing down an entire continent, refused to surrender. She surprised everyone with her extraordinary courage and political acumen. Her most famous moment came in 1741, when she traveled to Hungary and addressed the Hungarian Diet. She was dressed in traditional Hungarian attire and appealed directly to the nobles, holding her infant son Joseph in her arms. She passionately asked for their help, and the Hungarian magnates, moved by her plea, famously pledged vitam et sanguinem, meaning our lives and blood. They raised an army, providing a crucial lifeline. This moment wasn't just emotional. It was a stroke of genius. Maria Theresa understood the power of direct appeal and the importance of securing the loyalty of her diverse kingdoms. She was an absolute monarch, but she understood she needed the support of her subjects, something her predecessors sometimes overlooked. The war was a brutal 8-year struggle. Maria Theresa lost Silesia to Prussia, a bitter defeat she would never forget or forgive, and she fought relentlessly to get it back in a later war. But she managed to hold on to the vast majority of her inheritance. She fought on multiple fronts against powerful enemies, often while managing personal crises. She gave birth to 16 children during her reign, balancing the demands of motherhood with those of ruling an empire. At war, she was a hands-on ruler involved in every aspect of government, from military strategy to finance. Contemporary accounts describe her working late into the night, tirelessly reviewing documents and issuing orders. Her resilience was not just about winning battles. It was about transforming her empire. During and after the war, Maria Theresa realized that to survive, the Habsburg monarchy needed to modernize. She initiated sweeping reforms in the military administration and education. She founded the Dionysian Military Academy, reorganized the tax system to ensure more stable revenue, and established a University of Innsbruck. She broke with old traditions, promoting officials based on merit rather than noble birth and centralizing control. These reforms were met with resistance from conservative nobles and regional diets, but Maria Theresa pushed them through with unwavering determination. She also faced deeply personal challenges. While she loved her husband Francis Stephen, who eventually became Holy Roman Emperor, he was not a strong political or military figure. His sudden death in 1765 devastated her. She went into deep mourning, wearing black for the rest of her life. Yet she continued to govern with the same intensity. She dealt with the difficult personalities of her children, particularly her rebellious son Joseph, who wanted to implement reforms faster than she thought wise. She navigated complex family dynamics, arranging marriages for her numerous children to strengthen alliances, often at the cost of their personal happiness. Maria Theresa also faced the immense challenge of the Enlightenment, a philosophical movement that challenged traditional authority. While she was a devout Catholic, she embraced some Enlightenment ideas such as promoting public health and education, but she fiercely resisted anything that undermined her absolute power or the Church's authority. By the time of her death in 1780, Maria Theresa had not only secured her throne but had transformed the Habsburg monarchy into a modern centralized state. She was a pragmatic ruler, sometimes ruthless, but always driven by a fierce love for her lands and her people. She had started with nothing but a legal claim and an empty treasury facing the combined might of Europe. Through sheer force of will, political brilliance, and an unbreakable spirit, she not only survived, but thrived, earning her place as one of the most remarkable and resilient rulers in European history. Number 4. The Emperor who survived revolution and personal tragedy. Imagine ruling for an astonishing 68 years, through revolutions, devastating wars, the collapse of old orders, and a string of unspeakable personal tragedies. This was the fate of Franz Joseph, the firstborn in 1830, who became Emperor of Austria. At the tender age of 18, in the midst of a violent revolution. His reign from 1848 to 1916 was a testament to endurance, a grim dance with the relentless forces of change that eventually consumed his empire. He was a symbol of stability in an age of chaos, a man who saw his world crumble around him, yet steadfastly refused to give up his duty. Franz Joseph was thrust into power during the revolutions of 1848, a wave of uprisings that swept across Europe, threatening to dismantle the Habsburg monarchy. His uncle, Emperor Ferdinand I, was deemed too weak to handle the crisis, and his father renounced his claim. So the young, inexperienced Franz Joseph became emperor, inheriting an empire in turmoil with rebellions raging in Vienna, Hungary, and Italy. He quickly learned that leadership meant making brutal decisions. He relied on his generals to suppress the revolts, using overwhelming force to restore order. This early experience forged in him a deep conservatism and a profound sense of duty to his ancient dynasty. The challenges never stopped. In the 1850s and 1860s, he faced two major military defeats that drastically reshaped his empire. In 1859, the Austrian army was defeated by France and Piedmont Sardinia in the Second Italian War of Independence, leading to the loss of Lombardy, a rich Italian province. Then, in 1866, Prussia, under Otto von Bismarck, inflicted a humiliating defeat on Austria at the Battle of Königgrätz. This 7 weeks war ended Austria's dominance in German affairs and led to the dissolution of the old German Confederation. These defeats were not just military. They were existential, forcing Franz Joseph to confront the weakness of his centralized state and the growing power of new nations. His response was a desperate act of resilience. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. This agreement transformed the Austrian Empire into the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, granting Hungary equal status within the empire. It was a pragmatic and often painful compromise. Driven by necessity, Franz Joseph had to make immense concessions to the Hungarians, something he deeply disliked, but he understood it was the only way to prevent the empire from fracturing entirely. He spent the rest of his reign navigating the complex and often contentious relationship between the two halves of his empire, mediating disputes and holding together a fragile political structure. His personal life was a Greek tragedy of unimaginable proportions. He married the beautiful and free-spirited Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi, but their marriage was deeply unhappy. She hated court life and preferred to travel, leaving Franz Joseph lonely and isolated. Their only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was a brilliant but troubled man who frequently clashed with his conservative father. In 1889, Rudolf was found dead, with his mistress, Mary Vetsera, in a notorious apparent murder-suicide at his hunting lodge, Maryling. This scandal, and the loss of his only male heir, devastated Franz Joseph, casting a long, dark shadow over his life. The tragedies continued. In 1898, his beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, was assassinated by an Italian anarchist in Geneva, stabbed with a file. Franz Joseph, already a man of deep sorrow, was left utterly alone. He famously remarked, "You know nothing of what it means to love someone and then bury them." These personal losses would have broken most people, but Franz Joseph simply retreated further into his rigid routine of duty and work. He saw his work as a form of survival, a way to keep the empire and himself from completely falling apart. He faced mounting pressure from various nationalist movements within his multi-ethnic empire. Czechs, Poles, South Slavs, and others increasingly demanded autonomy or independence, threatening the unity of his domain. Franz Joseph tried to balance these demands, often with limited success, constantly putting out political fires and holding together a diverse collection of peoples under one aging crown. He stubbornly clung to tradition and avoided radical reforms, believing that continuity was the best way to preserve his empire. His final test came in 1914. The assassination of his nephew and heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo, plunged Europe, by now an old man of 84, reluctantly signed the declaration of war, knowing it would be a catastrophic conflict. He had seen countless wars, but this one was different. He saw his empire already fragile, drawn into a global conflagration. He died in November 1916, 2 years into the war, having reigned longer than any other Habsburg. He did not live to see the final collapse of his empire in 1918. Franz Joseph I was a king who never smiled easily. Burdened by an inherited sense of duty and an endless stream of misfortune, he was not a meek reformer, but a steadfast anchor in a turbulent age. His resilience was a quiet, stoic perseverance, a commitment to his imperial mission that transcended personal grief and political setbacks. He held his diverse, crumbling empire together for an incredible span of time, a true survivor who bore the weight of history on his shoulders until his last breath. Number 3. The emperor who was born to be a failure but became a legend. Imagine being the younger brother, always in the shadow, plagued by illness and considered too weak to rule. This was the early life of Ferdinand I, born in 1801, a Habsburg prince whose physical and mental challenges were so severe that his family seriously doubted his capacity to govern. Yet against all odds, he became Emperor of Austria in 1835. He reigned during a period of intense political unrest, and though often dismissed as a mere figurehead, his very survival on the throne amidst the revolutionary storms of 1848 speaks volumes about his quiet resilience and the unwavering loyalty of those around him. Ferdinand suffered from epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and other ailments that left him physically frail and mentally impaired. He had difficulty speaking clearly and was often described as simple-minded or childlike. His intellectual limitations were obvious to everyone at court, and his family worried constantly about the succession. His father, Emperor Francis I, reportedly told his son's tutor, "It does not matter whether he is clever or not, as long as he is good and loyal to me." This low expectation set the stage for a reign that many anticipated would be a disaster. When his father died in 1835, Ferdinand ascended to the throne, but real power lay with his council, particularly the formidable statesman Clemens von Metternich. Ferdinand's role was largely ceremonial. He was affectionately known as Ferdinand the Good by his subjects, not for great deeds, but for his gentle nature and his habit of granting small favors. He was genuinely kind and well-meaning, but hardly a strong ruler in a time that desperately needed one. The greatest test of Ferdinand's reign, and indeed his personal resilience, came in 1848. A wave of revolutions swept across Europe, sparked by discontent over authoritarian rule, economic hardship, and growing nationalist sentiments. Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg Empire, erupted in open revolt. Students, workers, and liberal reformers took to the streets, demanding a constitution, freedom of the press, and the end of Metternich's conservative regime. The emperor himself became a symbol of the old order that revolutionaries wanted to tear down. The palace was surrounded, and the royal family was under threat. Ferdinand was forced to make humiliating concessions. He dismissed Metternich, who fled the country, and agreed to a new constitution. But the unrest continued, escalating into violent street battles. At one point, the imperial family had to flee. Vienna first to Innsbruck and later to Olomouc. This flight, forced by his own rebellious subjects, was a deeply humbling experience for a monarch. Ferdinand was not a leader who strategized or inspired troops. His role during the revolution was that of a pawn, a figurehead around whom the crisis swirled, yet his very presence, however weak, was crucial. He represented the legitimacy of the dynasty, a continuity that many, even among the revolutionaries, struggled to completely reject. He endured the indignity of being moved around, signing decrees he barely understood and witnessing the near collapse of his ancient house. His resilience lay not in his actions, but in his enduring spirit and the quiet strength he drew from his family and loyal advisors. He was often distressed by the violence and chaos, but he never completely broke. He held firmly to his Catholic faith, which provided a source of inner calm. He was also deeply attached to his family, and their support was vital in helping him cope with the overwhelming pressure. His wife, Empress Maria Anna, provided him with quiet support and managed his daily life, while his more capable relatives, particularly his ambitious sister-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, maneuvered behind the scenes to save the dynasty. The turning point came when his powerful relatives, realizing that Ferdinand could not effectively lead, decided he must abdicate. This was an incredibly difficult decision for everyone involved, especially for Ferdinand himself. In December 1848, at a ceremony in Olomouc, Ferdinand formally renounced his throne in favor of his 18-year-old nephew, Franz Joseph. It was a moment of profound significance, a transfer of power that stabilized the dynasty at its most perilous moment. Ferdinand lived for another 27 years after his abdication. Enjoying a quiet life in Prague, he continued to be deeply loved by the Bohemian people. Despite his limitations, he performed his ceremonial duties with grace and was genuinely kind to his staff and those who approached him. His unique legacy is not of a powerful ruler, but of a deeply challenged individual who, through sheer endurance and the unwavering support of his loyalists, managed to remain a symbol of legitimacy during a period of revolutionary fervor. Ferdinand I was the weakest of the Habsburg emperors in terms of personal capabilities, yet he survived the most dangerous internal crisis the dynasty had faced in centuries. His resilience was a quiet strength, a gentle perseverance in the face of immense personal and political adversity, making him an unlikely but undeniable survivor in the turbulent history of the Habsburgs. Number 2. The architect who dreamed of empire, then gave it all up. Imagine being born with immense power, then building an even greater empire, only to decide it's all too much. Walking away from the throne and disappearing into quiet retirement. This was the extraordinary path of Charles V, born in 1500, a man whose reign was a whirlwind of war, rebellion, and vast global expansion. He inherited an empire where the sun never set from Spain to the Americas, Austria to the Netherlands. His resilience was tested in constant battles against rivals and religious upheaval, culminating in a dramatic abdication that stunned Europe. Charles V was the grandson of Maximilian I, the last knight, and Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. He inherited a dizzying array of titles and lands: Spain, its American colonies, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, the Netherlands, and Austria. Then, in 1519, he was elected Holy Roman Emperor, adding Germany and northern Italy to his already sprawling domain. He was barely out of his teens, yet he commanded an empire that dwarfed anything Europe had seen since ancient Rome. This immense power brought with it equally immense problems. Charles V found himself locked in a non-stop struggle on three major fronts. First, his lifelong rivalry with King Francis I of France was a constant drain. They fought 4 major wars for control of Italy and Burgundy, battles that were costly in lives and treasure. Charles, famously captured Francis I at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, but even that triumph did not end the conflict. These wars forced Charles to be constantly on the move, leading his armies in person, facing the dangers of battle and the tedium of sieges. Second, the Protestant Reformation exploded in his German land. Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church divided the Holy Roman Empire, with many German princes embracing the new faith. Charles, a devout Catholic, saw it as his duty to maintain religious unity and suppress heresy. He spent decades trying to reconcile the factions, holding diets, issuing edicts, and eventually resorting to war. He won a significant victory against the Protestant Schmalkaldic League in 1547 at the Battle of Mühlberg, but the religious divisions were too deep. He found himself fighting his own subjects, a conflict that tore at the very heart of his empire and his personal beliefs. Third, the Ottoman Empire under the brilliant Suleiman the Magnificent presented a terrifying existential threat. The Ottomans had conquered much of Hungary, besieged Vienna in 1529, and dominated the Mediterranean. Charles considered the Ottomans his most dangerous enemy, and he personally led costly campaigns against them, like the conquest of Tunis in 1535. This was a relentless, multi-generational struggle that forced Charles to maintain a huge military presence on his eastern and southern borders. Beyond these three major adversaries, Charles also faced constant challenges in his vast American colonies, managing internal revolts in Spain and dealing with financial crises. His empire was incredibly expensive to run, and the silver from the Americas, while immense, often arrived too late or fueled inflation. He spent his entire adult life traveling, crisscrossing Europe by carriage and ship, often ill with gout, trying to manage his sprawling domains. Chroniclers reported that he journeyed more than 10,000 miles in his reign, a staggering feat for the time. He never had a fixed capital. His court was always on the move. His personal life was also marked by a deep loss. His beloved wife, Isabella of Portugal, died in 1539, leaving him heartbroken. He never remarried, and her death deepened his already melancholic nature. He was a reserved and often solitary man, despite his immense power burdened by the weight of his duties and the endless conflict. By the mid-1550s, after more than 30 years of non-stop warfare and political struggle, Charles V was utterly exhausted. His body was failing, ravaged by gout and other ailments. His spirit was worn down by the constant battles, especially the failure to achieve religious unity in Germany. He felt he had failed in his divinely appointed mission. He made the unprecedented decision to abdicate his vast empire, an act almost unheard of for a reigning monarch. In a series of emotional ceremonies in 1555 and 1556, Charles formally handed over his various crowns. He gave the Holy Roman Empire to his brother, Ferdinand I, and the Spanish Empire, with all its global possessions, to his son, Philip II. He then retired to the monastery of Yuste in rural Spain. There he lived out his final 2 years free from the crushing responsibilities of empire, devoting himself to prayer, gardening, and his mechanical clocks. Charles V's resilience was not just in his ability to fight and win, but in his extraordinary capacity to endure decades of relentless pressure, balancing multiple existential threats simultaneously. His ultimate act of resilience might have been his abdication, a recognition of his own limits, and a deliberate choice to step away from a burden that had become too heavy. He built an empire of staggering proportions, fought to the brink for its unity, and then with quiet dignity chose a life of peace, leaving an indelible mark on history through his sheer tenacity. And his extraordinary journey. Number 1. The emperor who refused to let his family or his empire die. Imagine losing your only son to suicide, your beloved wife to assassination, and your entire world to the brink of a global war. Yet you stubbornly refuse to quit holding on to power for nearly 7 decades. This was the truly astounding life of Franz Joseph, the firstborn in 1830, whose reign from 1848 to 1916 was the longest in Habsburg history. a testament to an almost superhuman capacity for endurance in the face of relentless tragedy. He was the stoic, unyielding rock of an empire that was slowly but surely crumbling around him. Franz Joseph was a young man when he was thrust onto the throne in 1848. Europe was in chaos, and the Habsburg Empire was on the verge of collapse, torn apart by revolutions in Vienna, Hungary, and Italy. At just 18, he had to make ruthless decisions, relying on military force to crush rebellions and restore a semblance of order. This baptism by fire instilled in him an iron will and a deep conservative sense of duty. He believed it was his sacred mission to preserve the Habsburg dynasty and its ancient empire at all costs. His reign was a continuous struggle against the forces of modernization and nationalism. In 1859, his army suffered a humiliating defeat against France in Piedmont, Sardinia, losing control of northern Italy. Then in 1866, Prussia, under Otto von Bismarck, decisively defeated Austria in the 7 Weeks' War, shattering Austrian dominance in Germany and forcing a complete restructuring of the empire. These were not just military losses, they were profound blows to the very identity of the Habsburg state. Franz Joseph's response to these defeats was a remarkable act of political resilience. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. This agreement created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, granting Hungary equal status within the empire. It was a difficult and often painful concession for the emperor, who had always favored a more centralized state. But he recognized that compromise was essential to prevent the empire from fracturing entirely. For the next 5 decades, he meticulously managed the complex and often contentious relationship between the two halves of his empire, mediating disputes and holding together a diverse collection of ethnic groups under one crown. It was a constant balancing act, requiring immense patience and an ability to swallow his personal preferences for the sake of survival. His personal life was a string of almost unimaginable tragedies. He married the famous Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi, a free-spirited and beautiful woman who hated the rigid formality of court life. Their marriage was strained, and she often traveled, leaving Franz Joseph alone. Their only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was a liberal intellectual who clashed constantly with his conservative father. In 1889, Rudolf was found dead with his mistress, Mary Vet Sarah, in a notorious murder-suicide at his hunting lodge, Merling. This scandal and the devastating loss of his only male heir were blows from which Franz Joseph never truly recovered. The official story was a heart attack, but the truth was far darker. A secret burden for the emperor, the personal torment did not end there. In 1898, his beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, was assassinated by an Italian anarchist in Geneva. Stabbed with a file, Franz Joseph, by then an old man, was left utterly heartbroken and alone. He famously remarked to a relative, "You know nothing of what it means to love someone and then bury them." These cumulative losses would have crushed most individuals, but Franz Joseph, with grim determination, simply retreated further into his work and his rigid daily routine, seeing his duty as the only constant in a world of pain and loss. He continued to face relentless pressure from rising nationalism within his multi-ethnic empire. Czechs, Poles, South Slavs, and others increasingly demanded autonomy or independence. Franz Joseph navigated these demands with a conservative, cautious hand, always prioritizing the unity of his empire, however fragile. He was a symbol of continuity, an aging patriarch trying to hold back the tide of modern history. His final test came in 1914. The assassination of his nephew and new heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo, ignited the spark that plunged Europe into World War I. Franz Joseph, an old man of 84, reluctantly signed the declaration of war. He had seen countless conflicts, but this one was different. A global conflagration that threatened to consume everything he had fought so hard to preserve. He lived through the first 2 brutal years of the war, witnessing its devastating toll on his empire and its people. He died in November 1916, at the age of 86, still on the throne, having ruled for an astonishing 68 years. Franz Joseph I was not a Majorib revolutionary or a brilliant military commander. He was a king defined by his sheer endurance, his unwavering commitment to duty, and his ability to absorb unimaginable personal sorrow and political setbacks without breaking. He held his crumbling, diverse empire together for an unprecedented length of time, an ultimate survivor who carried the weight of his family's tragedies and his empire's decline on his shoulders until his very last breath. His life stands as a monumental testament to the power of resilience. In the face of endless adversity,